Hello everyone, RetroChris here. Back in the days, I was a massive Sega boy, and I did happen to own the Sega Master System 2, as well as the Sega Mega Drive, also known as the Sega Genesis in the US. I did also happen to own the Sega Game Gear, that was the handheld console from Sega, but sadly, I don't own that anymore. Yet.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
During the 80s and 90s, there was an all-out console war between Nintendo and Sega, and both companies had their respective first and second generation of consoles. As I said, Sega had the Master System and the Mega Drive, while Nintendo had the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. They both competed for the dominion of the video game market all over the world, and as they say, all is fair in love and war.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
Now, just as a little side note, in this time of history, we are in fact into the third and fourth generation of consoles. But just to make it easier for myself and for you, I'm just gonna refer to the years when Sega Master System and the Nintendo Entertainment System dominated the market to be the first generation. Before this, it was mainly Atari and like Intellivision, ColecoVision, the Odyssey, and a bunch of Pong consoles that flooded the market from like 1972 to like the 1980s before Sega and Nintendo took over. But let's turn time forward to the year of 1996.
Captain, there's something heading our way extremely fast. It's coming straight at us. I've never seen anything like it before.
Action, racing, fun, adventure. Nintendo 64, the fastest, most powerful games console on Earth, now at $99.99.
In the year of 1996, Nintendo would release their third generation of consoles, the legendary Nintendo 64. Now, there is no point in explaining the legacy that this console have in the video game history. We all know it. It is awesome. At the same time, Sega released their third generation console named Sega Saturn. I'll admit, when I grew up, I never even heard of this one, and I don't recall anyone owning this console. As far as I understand, the launch of this console was absolutely horrible. The console was announced to be released on September 2nd, 1995, but Sega of Japan demanded an earlier release to be able to compete with the upcoming Sony PlayStation. This resulted in a surprise release, which meant the stores had absolutely no time to market the console, and some even dropped Sega from their lineup. It was a complete shit show. The console would also be marketed with a price of $399, while the Sony PlayStation was sold for $100 less, at a price of $299. This badly hurt Sega's reputation, which we will come back to later. But there was one console that was marketed, and holy damn! I was excited for this one. Now, this would be Sega's fourth generation of consoles, and this one would later compete with the Microsoft Xbox, the Sony PlayStation 2, and the Nintendo GameCube. I remember clearly reading about this in the gaming magazines, and I do remember seeing pictures of it. And the name. Oh, the name. Like, the first moment I saw this console, I knew this would be mind-blowing. But sadly, I never got my hands on one. And the Sega Mega Drive would be the last Sega console that I owned growing up. But I don't remember anyone having this console, so maybe there is a reason for that. Now, the console I'm talking about is, of course, the Sega Dreamcast. Now, what happened to this console? Like, it was looking so goddamn promising, but somehow, this would be the last console Sega would ever make.
Oh yeah, I'm feeling the love. You feel the love. Yo, what's your name? Scary Payton, but they call me the glove. How you feeling tonight? Yo, I'm feeling the love. Feel the love, glove. I'm feeling the Sonic. Yo, Sonic. Man, stay off the light speed.
My bad.
Sonic Adventure on Sega Dreamcast. It's thinking.
The Sega Dreamcast was released on November 27th, 1998 in Japan, and then later in the US and Europe in 1999. But once again, Sega would have some troubles with their release. This time, Sega did actually receive a lot of interest and many pre-orders. But then Sega had some problems with producing enough Dreamcasts due to a shortage of a Power VR chipset caused by it having a really high failure rate during production. This led to Sega stopping pre-orders, obviously losing them a lot of sales. Sega also promised the new Sonic game, Sonic Adventures, to be released along with the console, but the game was delayed a couple of weeks. The sales didn't live up to Sega of Japan's expectations, so they did as they have done many times before. They reduced the price of the console to a level they would no longer earn profit from the sales. But it did result in more units sold, and with the release of Namco's Soul Calibur, they did gain a 17% on their shares. In the US, the release was actually pretty good. While Sega was still feeling the setback from the Sega Saturn launch, and many retail owners didn't really have the best relationship to Sega at the time, being a bit hesitant to another Sega release. EA, the biggest third-party video game publisher at the time, would also cut all their bonds with Sega, saying they would never develop games for this console. At the same time, Sony was already starting to market their new PlayStation 2, which saw a lot of hype, so Sega was in general in a really rough spot at the time. But even so, the sales were actually pretty good and could be called a successful launch. In Europe, the launch was also successful, and by Christmas in 1999, Sega of Europe had sold 500,000 units, 6 months ahead of schedule. But the sales didn't continue on this pace, so in total they sold about 1 million units in Europe total. So there is no denying that the sales in total wasn't really the best, and in 2000 Sega had a change of president. The new president had long before advocated that Sega would abandon the console business, and not longer after he came into his new position, he got his wish. In January 2001, Sega announced they would discontinue the Sega Dreamcast and withdraw from the console market as a whole, focusing on being a third-party developer. 9.13 million Dreamcasts were sold worldwide, and the last Dreamcasts were sold at a price as low as $49.95. That is a fucking disgrace for this console. And I don't know, like, growing up with Sega, there's just something about this whole story about Sega and the Sega Dreamcast that just pisses me off. And I'm not saying that they made a wrong decision about withdrawing from the console market completely. Like, Sega still lives today due to that. So my question is, like, did it have to come to that point? That is what's bothering me. Sega was a respected company, and they were a worthy competitor to Nintendo back in the 80s and early 90s, but just a lot of stupid and, in my opinion, greedy mistakes just resulted in a slow and steady downfall of the company's reputation that would affect any future launch. And this console right here, this insanely powerful, innovative, beautiful behemoth, paid the price. And that is fucking unfair. Like, could you imagine how well this console could have made it if just Sega didn't fuck up the launch of the Sega Saturn? Or how they completely ruined their reputation with like the stupid add-ons for the Sega Mega Drive or the Genesis, like the Sega CD and the Sega 32X, that just made Sega a laughingstock. And the fact that they didn't have enough consoles for the launch, that did affect their sales badly, and as well as having one game for the launch itself, sadly, that is an answer that we will never get. And as someone who grew up with Sega, this story just makes me really, really sad. And I'm not joking when I say that I haven't stopped thinking about the Sega Dreamcast since the very first moment I saw it. And now, here we are today, and I'm holding it in my hand. Like, even though Dreamcast couldn't really compete in a strong market against big companies like Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, there is no denying that this console has a legacy. Even to this date, many people would say that this console is the best console ever made. And you know what? I have to agree. It's even hard to fathom how innovative this console was at its time. Sega Dreamcast was an impressive and insanely powerful console when it was released. Having hardware capable of practically porting arcade games perfectly to this console was an amazing feature. Sega Dreamcast was also the first console to come with a modem, and it introduced the console-based online gaming. And do remember, this was 1999. And it was also the first console to have free downloadable content for the games. Even the memory cards was innovating, as they used the visual memory units actually capable of playing minigames on the memory card itself, as well as having 2 ports for the memory cards on each controller, being able to plug into 2 memory cards and exchange data. The controls even had microphone attachments and voice recognition that were used in games like Seaman. At the time of its release, Sega Dreamcast was clearly superior to anything. It is truly sad to see this console take the consequences of Sega's past decisions, and being a true example of being ahead of its time. This is, to this day, one of the greatest consoles ever made. As I've said, the fate of the Sega Dreamcast does truly break my heart, but at the same time, it is truly emotional to see the legacy that this console have today. And we need to promise ourselves that we will never ever forget about the Sega Dreamcast. But hey, what about the games themselves? Now, I do have a few games here, and except for Sonic Adventures, I have never played any of these games before, so tune in next time and we will try out some games for the Dreamcast and see what this console is all about.